This video will help you decide which deck you should play in GOAT format, a legacy format of Yu-Gi-Oh that was originally played during the summer of 2005.
This is it, Yugi. The final duel. I'm getting those god cards. I've analyzed every one of your moves, every strategy, every follicle on your f***ing foreskin.
To start, I would recommend perusing the deck lists on goatformat.com and gaining an understanding of the different deck archetypes. Archetypes are similar across formats and across card games as a whole, so if you've played another card game in the past, you'll probably be familiar with some of these. Aggressive or aggro decks are decks that want to play to the board quickly with monsters that represent a high damage output as fast as possible to try to reduce your opponent's life points to 0 as quickly as possible. Some examples of this include vanilla aggro, which is a deck of deploying high attack value normal type monsters quickly to the field. You have attribute specific aggro decks such as light, water, fire, etc. that focus on a specific attribute and have cards that are specific payoffs for playing that type of attribute. Consider Blue Eyes White Dragon aggro if you want to turbo out the namesake Blue Eyes White Dragon card extremely fast. You have things like Horus aggro and Silent Swordsman aggro that focus on those leveling monsters and trying to power out the higher level versions of those monsters to control the field. You have Toon aggro that plays some of the iconic monsters that Pegasus played in the Yu-Gi-Oh TV show.
Welcome, Kaiba, to Toon World!
And one of the most popular examples would be Warrior aggro, which tends to do well in high-level GOAT events and is one of the most theoretically explored aggressive decks in the GOAT format. Now, if you're more of a fan of slower, grindier games, control decks might be the archetype that you tend to gravitate towards. Control wants to grind out in a longer game by accruing value over a period of time, not allowing the opponent to kill you quickly, and winning in the long game by gaining card advantage, dealing with all of your opponent's threats, and eventually just winning by all the advantage you've gained. Control decks could include something such as Jam Control, which focuses around the card Jam Breeding Machine to enable more powerful cards like Horn of Heaven and Needle Sealing. You have a deck like Flip Control that abuses the effects of flip effect monsters and tries to recycle those effects while stalling your opponent from attacking you. You also have the namesake Goat Control deck, the deck that the format is named after, which uses powerful threats such as Metamorphosis on a Scapegoat to make Thousand Eye Restrict, as well as Chaos Soldier Envoy of Beginning, in conjunction with other effects to accrue card advantage over the game. And you also have Chaos Control, which is similar to Go Control but has more light and dark attribute monsters to power out more chaos monsters from your deck. Now, another type of deck they don't mention on goatformat.com that is also commonly seen in most card games is called Midrange. Midrange decks can play the role of either an aggressive or a control deck. They have a more flexible game plan based on the position they need to take in a certain matchup. These are decks that can deploy powerful threats quickly, but can also accrue card advantage over the long game and have a little bit more grindy potential than the traditional aggro deck.
I tribute summon Dark Magician in attack position! Destroy his battle ox!
I think the best example of a deck like this would be the popular Chaos Turbo deck, which is currently one of the most popular decks in GOAT format, at least at the highest level of play. This deck uses cards like Thunder Dragon and Night Assailant to get discard fodder, benefit from the effects of specific flip effect monsters, and power out chaos monsters. Then you have Combo Decks, which tries to win based on using the combination of several cards together to create some sort of effect more powerful than the individual cards themselves, and ideally try to kill the opponent within one turn. The most common example I can give of this is something like Exodia, where if you have all 5 pieces in your hand, you instantly win, but there are a lot more decks that are much more popular than Exodia Combo. One of those decks is Library FTK, FTK standing for First Turn Kill, not to be confused with OTK, which is One Turn Kill. First Turn Kill tries to kill your opponent on the first turn of the game, and Library does this by playing Royal Magical Library, playing out a bunch of spells, drawing several cards, taking a lot of damage from your own card effects, reversing your life total with your opponent, and then playing a card to shoot your opponent for the final points of damage. Sounds pretty convoluted, and it is, but combo decks are pretty fun if they get to do what they want to do. You have Reasoning Gate, which is one of the most popular combo decks, utilizing the effects of Reasoning and Monster Gate to special summon powerful monsters to your field, putting them in the graveyard, banishing them, returning them back from the banished zone, recycling their effects, accruing a lot of cards, building a big board state, trying to kill your opponent in one turn. Empty Jar uses the effects of either Morphing Jar or Cyber Jar to have you and your opponent loot through your entire decks by discarding your hands and drawing cards over and over again to try and mill the opponent's entire deck out, so when they go to their draw phase, they instantly lose. The deck Huge Revolution uses a bunch of wimpy normal type monsters to enable the card Huge Revolution that effectively destroys all cards in your opponent's hand and field and sets you up to win the game in a variety of different ways. Burn focuses on killing your opponent with spells and traps rather than traditional combat damage, and has effects that inflict damage directly to your opponent's life points in large increments as effectively as possible. Now, if none of these other archetypes sound fun to you, maybe you'll enjoy an archetype that doesn't allow your opponent to have fun. Consider a lockdown strategy. Lockdown decks often feature cards that shut down the possibility for your opponent's deck to attack, such as Gravity Bind, Level Limit Area B, Swords of Revealing Light, Wall of Revealing Light, and things of that nature. Final Countdown is a lockdown deck that tries to stall the game for 20 turns and then win the game with its namesake card. Pac-Man is a combo deck that features flip effect monsters to control the flow of the game. It's actually pretty similar to Flip Control. However, Pac-Man doesn't focus on buying back key spells and traps. Instead, the monsters accrue value of their own and then flip themselves back face down, and it relies more on continuous effects that control the board, such as the cards we mentioned before. Destiny Board Lockdown uses the fan favorite Destiny board cards to try and win the game via that effect. Spatial Collapse Lockdown restricts the amount of zones your opponent has access to so they can deploy less cards. Meanwhile, you are gunking up their slots with useless fodder, such as from the effective Omega Trio. And then something like Direct Attack Combo focuses on stopping your opponent from attacking you while using lower level monsters that can directly attack your opponent regardless of what they have in play. Some other things you may want to consider when picking your deck for Yu-Gi-Oh! GOAT format are the skill intensity of the deck. What is the minimum skill required to play the deck at a very basic level? This is not to be confused with the skill it takes to play the deck at the highest level. Basically, there will be some decks that are harder to pick up than others, and then some decks that are harder to master than others. Because some decks can only be piloted by the master of games. For example, a deck such as Warriors would be something I would recommend to a newer GOAT format player. Warriors is extremely hard to play at the highest level because there's a lot of different play patterns involved in the deck, but it's also a relatively easy deck to understand fundamentally because of how streamlined its game plan is. A newer player may also want to play a deck such as Chaos Turbo, a deck which basic game plan is relatively simple to understand, but it's also a great deck to pick up because it's one of the stronger decks in the format. It doesn't really have any awful matchups that you automatically lose to, and there's a lot of room to grow and improve with the deck because it also has a very high skill ceiling. Meanwhile, a deck such as GOAT Control, I would say, has a much higher skill floor. At a basic fundamental level, this deck is a bit difficult to pilot because of how many interactions there are, how many different game plans the deck can have, and how many different micro decisions there are that can impact whether you're able to win or lose the game that take a lot of experience with the format to really understand. A lot of more control decks will feature a bit of a higher ceiling just because control decks have to interact more with your opponent's deck, meaning you want to have more format knowledge before you can pilot those types of decks to the maximum effectiveness. If you're interested in something like a combo deck, I will warn you that combo decks typically do have a higher ceiling just because you need to learn how the combo works before you can actually play the deck. You can't just put the pile of 40 cards together and suddenly just expect to kind of know what you're doing. You may need to practice even just goldfishing it with yourself a few times, or playing against a friend or someone else who knows how to play the deck. However, the skill ceiling of combo decks does vary. Something like Empty Jar has a much lower skill ceiling because the deck is kind of a one-trick wonder. It has one thing it wants to do really, really well, which is decking your opponent within the first couple of turns. And once you learn how to do that and how to deploy the deck, it becomes easy to repeat that process. But another combo deck such as Reasoning Gate has multiple different ways it can play, different ways to sequence the cards, different ways to attack the opponent. And figuring out which of those ways is best based on the situation you're in will take a higher skill level. So there are some combo decks that will have more room for growth and improvement than others. And I just want to be clear that every deck deck in GOAT format does require a significant amount of skill to play. I don't want to knock anyone's favorite pet deck, but some decks are harder to play at the highest level than others. Something else you want to think about is deck consistency. This includes how often the deck is actually able to achieve its primary game plan. Decks that have more individually powerful cards typically are a bit more consistent than decks that need multiple cards to work well together. This is because cards by themselves don't rely on other cards to make them good. Bare basics example, Breaker the Magical Warrior is a solid card. It doesn't require anything else to make it good, it just has a great effect on its own. Meanwhile, something such as Charcoal Impachi doesn't really do anything. It's only good if it's in conjunction with the other cards that turn on the Huge Revolution combo deck. And you can see how that in some decks that have less consistency, you will have certain draws that will be extremely powerful and certain draws that will be kind of mopey. And if you're okay with that, you might be comfortable playing those types of decks, but if you want a deck that's going to consistently achieve a solid game plan every time, you may want to opt for something more like an aggro or control deck rather than a combo or lockdown strategy. Again, this is not something that applies to every single deck in those categories, it is just a broad generalization. And then do be mindful that decks that are less consistent typically do wind up being more powerful when they get the higher end of variance. So there is a reward for playing those decks that aren't as consistent because they do something extremely powerful when they tend to work. Meanwhile, more consistent decks can only be so strong even with their best possible draws. Also lumped into this is deck variety. Variety includes how different the deck will run each time you play it. Some decks will do the same thing each and every time and have a specific way that they want to win. And usually those decks are pretty good at winning in a particular way. But there are other decks that can have games that look completely different from one another and can win through a variety of different mechanisms. And typically the decks that win in a variety of different ways do have a higher skill ceiling. And again, these variables all kind of mix in and intertwine with each other. For some people, matchup favorability is extremely important. This determines how good or bad your deck is against certain other decks in the meta. Oftentimes, this is important when you're preparing for a tournament or going to your local shop. If you expect the meta to line up in a certain way, if you expect the room to be geared towards a specific archetype, you may want to bring a deck that's more geared to take down those types of decks. And if you plan on playing Paper Goat specifically, another factor you may want to consider is price. I'll include another helpful link in the description below to help you determine which decks are more or less expensive. But for example, you could build a version of the deck that costs $30 or another version of the same deck that costs nearly $200. And it also matters if you want to pimp out your deck with cool holographic cards and whatever. And the final category, which I don't think I've ever really heard anyone else talk about, I'll call it style. You need to play a deck that plays cards and plays in a way that you enjoy. Because regardless of any of the other pointers I give to you, you're gonna play the best Yu-Gi-Oh! If you play a deck that you have fun playing, a deck with cards that you enjoy deploying. Don't play a deck just because you think it's the best deck in the format. Play a deck that you think lines up with your personal playstyle, that you think you can pilot well, or you can innovate on, and you will see a lot more success that way. Once you pick a few decks that you think look cool, make sure to test them out on duelingbook.com, which is a free platform that you can use to play GOAT format with your friends. If you're looking for people to play against, come hang out in my Discord and also check out the GOAT format Discord. I'll include both those links in the description below. If you're new to GOAT, I recommend checking out my previous video for a full introduction on the format, the rules, top decks in the format, and why to play GOAT. Make sure to subscribe if you found this video helpful, and as always, happy dueling, gamer.